The purpose of these videos is to orient you to what components look like and how you act on them. If you haven't yet viewed the Watch Me First video, please do that first, as it lets you know what to expect. As you read in Chapter 5, a segment is a defined chunk of data that is identified as meaningful for the purposes of analysis. In this video, we discuss the status of segments as components, we show how to identify and work with them, and some of the actions that can be taken on segments.
As we discussed in Chapter 5, segments are not strictly speaking components, because they're not independent items that can be acted upon in their own right. We mean two things by this. First of all, although we can select any chunk of data, as I am doing now, this doesn't actually become a segment that we can act upon unless we link it to a code. In other words, we have to code segments in order to enable them to be lifted out of their source context. This actually turns them into coded segments, and there's a separate video about coded segments. Secondly, as a result of this, there is no one place in MAXQDA where all segments are listed together, regardless of the actions that are taken upon them, and therefore you won't see a main menu across the top for segments. Although segments are not independent items in their own right, we do think about them as if they were components, because the process of identifying meaningful chunks of data and working with them in various ways is central to qualitative analysis. So let's have a look at creating segments. As you've seen, we can select a segment in a text file of any size. It can be as small as one word or even a character, or go across multiple paragraphs as required. The same is true in PDF files and any other text files. Let's have a quick look in a tabular text file. Here we've got some tweets, and I can select a word or indeed part of a row to turn that into a segment to code. If I'm working with image data, then I can select part of an image as a segment. Equally, if I'm working with video data, then I can either select text from the associated transcript, or as I'm doing here, I can select part of the video to identify as a segment. However, because we have to link segments to something to enable them to be lifted out of their documents, let's look at the actions that we can take on segments. Like all components, there are common actions that can be taken on segments. However, because segments are different from other components in that they're not independent items in their own right, there are some exceptions. We can create segments at any time, as we've just seen. However, we cannot actually name or rename them like we can other components because they're not independent. We can search the content of segments, but only once they've been linked to other components. We can write about segments in comments, but again, only once they've been coded. Segments themselves cannot be sorted or visualised as they don't exist in one central place within MAXQDA, but segments that have been coded can be sorted and visualised in different ways, and we discuss coded segments in a separate video on that component. Action specifics of segments are that we can link them to codes or other segments, and resize them to include more or less data. So let's go and have a look at a couple of those actions. When we select a chunk of data that we want to think about as a segment and right-click on it, we can see the various actions that we could take on that segment. I'm going to do this now just using text as an example. So I'm selecting the segment that I'm interested in, and when I right-click on it, I've got various actions available to me. If I choose to code it with a new code, that's the process of coding. The new code could represent anything I wanted it to, of course, a concept, a topic, a theme in our project, or indeed anything else that we want to capture within the data. If I wanted to code this segment to an existing code, then I can just do that by dragging and dropping, so choosing the code I'm interested in and dragging and dropping, and that will code that segment. I'll just show you how to link two segments to one another, because that is an action that you can take on segments to the exclusion of coding. So let's imagine that this segment I've got highlighted here reminds me of another segment that I want to link it to. I can right-click and choose the Insert Document Link option. Go to the other segment that I'm interested in. In this example, I'm just going to link it to a segment in the same document, but the other segment could be in any document and indeed could be of a different data type, part of an image or a video file, for example. But when I now right-click and choose Insert Document Link, I've created a link between these two segments, and when I hover my cursor over each link, I can see the content of the other segment. You will also have noticed that I can link segments to other items, external files, web links, or geolinks. The important thing to understand about segments is that they only become independent items when they have been linked to codes, thus making them into coded segments. As I said earlier, coded segments are a separate component in our way of thinking about MAXQDA, so watching the videos about codes and coded segments will further your understanding about segments.